I've got an all-star panel this Friday night to help us cut through the political noise. I have President and CEO of Democracy Forward, Skye Perryman. She's also the author of the upcoming book, Ordinary People, Extraordinary Times, How to Reclaim Your Power, Fight for Freedom, and Reimagine Democracy. Democratic strategist Joel Payne joins us as well. National political reporter for Time Magazine, Eric Cordelesa, and Mark Bednar, who served as Director of Communications for former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Glad to have all of you guys here tonight. Thank you. And Mark, I'll begin with you because the DHS is not only threatening jail time, which is very significant, it's also threatening to withhold federal funding for elections. Why take this particular approach?
Well, I think basically after the speech last night, will be yet to be borne out. Something that's really a breath of fresh air, kind of exciting, kind of reassuring about Markwayne Mullin, his presence being at DHS, stark departure from Kristi Noem, who kind of operated on an island. Markwayne Mullin, much like the late Lindsey Graham, is seen as like a bridge between the Senate and the Trump administration. Like, he got a bipartisan vote in the Senate, and he gets a lot of accolades for actually communicating quite well with the Hill. So I think that there's still a lot of time and a lot of developments here. He'll be able to explain himself both to the Senate, to the American public. Of course, if somebody broke the law, that should be something that, should concern all Americans. But of course, it's very reasonable to say that there's still a lot of questions to be answered here.
Certainly, and by the way, now that he's head of, that particular division and ICE is under it, maybe his goodwill is, in terms of credibility and communication, might be faltering a little bit on things. But Eric, the president struck a very hostile tone against China, who he accuses, as we all heard last night, of carrying out the largest compromise of election data in history. Many people thought once he made that statement, there would be an accompanying, sanction or discussion about China or how to punish. That didn't happen. Why?
Well, he doesn't really have the goods. They produced a lot of documentation. They revealed a lot of sort of reports or intelligence, but none of it amounted to these very sweeping claims that President Trump was making. In fact, shortly after he gave this speech, John Solomon, who he sort of asked to spearhead this investigation, went before the cameras in the White House and said that they hadn't exactly proven their case yet and they were still going to go forward with investigations. I think it's very clear that President Trump is trying to shore up support among the Republican base to put pressure on lawmakers to pass the Save America Act, which has become one of his central preoccupations right now. And I also think what you're seeing with Markwayne Mullin and others is the use of intimidation as its own method to try to make state election officials fear, defying the administration, to try and submit to their demands going into this very consequential midterm election, because, as we can see, he is trying to have an impact on the way this election is going to be carried out.
And yet there are some he's not going to be able to put a lot of pressure on because they're either outgoing or, and I don't mean like charismatic, I mean they are leaving, like they are going out, right? There could be a little bit both, that's true, but every Republican was not very happy with what he had to say. I want to play for you some of what Senators Cornyn and Cassidy had to say.
We have 109 days until the midterm elections. And I don't understand talking about what happened 6 years ago in light of these upcoming elections.
As a Republican, my concern is that it's setting up a Democratic wave election. We should be talking about what matters to the people around the kitchen table. And right now they can't afford their health care, their housing, their groceries, or the gasoline.
And this is what some of the polling reflects already, right? He's underwater in his polling, and yet he is playing what he thinks is a very strong, familiar song, but look at the approval rating there. I mean, Joel, when you look at this, why is he on this particular train? And does he think that somehow it's going to play well in the upcoming midterm elections?
Well, I agree with some of Eric's point that he certainly views this as a way to get people, to bully people into focusing on the Save America Act. He thinks it's a way to kind of set up this straw man going into the fall, this idea that our elections are stolen, but they're only stolen when he's president, right? Because what he essentially has said is that when Joe Biden and when Barack Obama were president, that the elections weren't stolen and that he won. But when he was president, the election was stolen in 2020. I mean, that's essentially what Donald Trump wants you and wants his supporters to believe. And as we're all sitting here at that table, that's a very rich, I mean, I got a bridge in Brooklyn I can sell you if you want to buy that. But the other point I would just make here is, listen, it is very cold comfort for a Democrat like me to have to put my trust in John Cornyn, Bill Cassidy, Tom Tillis, any of these Republicans who claim to be firebrands against Donald Trump right now. These folks have shirked from every fight Donald Trump has put in front of them. And I can guarantee you, when the time comes to actually stand up and do something, they won't. Because Donald Trump has read all of these people the exact same way since he's been on the public stage. He knows that the core of establishment Republican thought in D.C. is hollowed out, and he can push them over and they'll roll over and play dead whenever he tells them to. So while I appreciate the nice words on the stage, I'd like to see that backed up with some action.
Well, people accuse Democrats, though, similarly, of not being able to, cash the check their mouths are writing, and oftentimes, right? And you've got the Senate Democrats, Ed Markey, framing the president's speech this way, Sky. Trump must be impeached for undermining and subverting our free and fair elections. And when he sends ICE agents to the polls, then we must turn civic action into civil disobedience and take to the streets, sit in, protest, withhold our labor. Everything must be on the table. Is that the right message for Democrats to counter?
I think the right message is the American people are not going to let this happen. I mean, they're not going to let this president steal the election, and here's why. The White House doesn't like to talk about this, but they're 0 for 16 in every single federal court. These aren't judge shop cases. This isn't one little judge sitting somewhere. Every single judge that's considered it has said, you know what, there's no basis for DOJ to ask for these voter rolls and to try to force the states to do it. We have blocked the DHS modified SAVE database that I think the secretary was talking about today, and we're going to be back in court to talk about that with the court next week. And so the courts are not a silver bullet, but the people are, and this administration is losing across the board on the agenda. You do have people, individual voters across the country, including in deep red areas, that are upset about what's going on. I think this was political suicide for a lot of Republicans who are going to have to answer questions to the people in their district about all of this election distraction, when really what people care about right now is affordability and, the fact none of us can eat vegetables right now because the president's decimated the government.
Yeah, of course.
Just to that point, Donald Trump has he's shown you what he has for you as the American people, what you have to vote on this November. It's not about passing a housing bill to make housing more affordable. It's not about making your groceries more affordable. It's not about doing all the things that he promised he would do when he swept into office almost 2 years ago. What it's about is he wants to make it harder for eligible people to vote, period. Because he thinks if he can pick his voters, it's going to be easier for him to push away the accountability that's coming at him for, frankly, a failed 2 years. Yep. Of his administration. And that's what Donald Trump has to say to the American people. And I think people should take that and assess appropriately.
One of the smartest things that have come out of kind of House legislation, especially Brian Style from the great state of Wisconsin, one of his major tenets of his voter ID bill to make sure that election integrity with voter ID for every American, but to make sure that it's free, make it easy to access. Take away Democrats' number one argument against major provisions of the Save America Act, like make the barrier super low, make it free. Let states have the ability to provide it. So hopefully that can stay intact in the House bill, so that if in fact they do go with this next reconciliation bill, undercut Democrats' argument right out from under them. I think with the fact that 70% of Americans support voter ID, make it free, make it easy. That way you can actually even have an easier coalition go in and that, have more support from Americans about this.
It was very telling, Eric. Fox News, they have distanced themselves from the president's speech. They did not do a whole segment on it. They weren't all day spending about it. They're the friendliest network to the president of the United States. And they kind of had a 10-foot pole on this. You also had Sean Spicer, the former Trump White House press secretary, who had this to say.
We need to have more of a call to action, more of a to-do list. I saw a lot of negative comments online last night from the MAGA faithful saying, what else can we be doing? What else are we doing? Raising an issue and then not having a solution is a little bit of a problem.
That is pretty much the through line for many people criticizing it, especially because a lot of it was not new. They'd heard a lot of this before. What was revealed in the documents did not somehow move the needle. There was not a proposal to how to change it. There wasn't, as mentioned, China. When you look at this and think about the base complaining, and a lot of people that are in support of Trump, not seeing the rubber meeting the road, why do you think he continues to pursue this?
Well, as you point out, it's a bit of a flop because it satisfied no one, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, it angered more moderate, more establishment Republicans who feels like this alienates average voters who don't think this is wise, who don't think it's really a salient issue going into this election. And obviously, it wasn't strong enough for the MAGA base and the hardliners who want him to really take a strong position and commandeer sort of federal forces to, interfere, if you will, in the election coming up. I think President Trump is obsessed with this issue. I think it's kind of pushing on an open door for him. And I think he's setting up a whole range of dynamics where, let's say they are not able to pass the SAVE Act. Right. Let's say Democrats and some Republicans block it. And let's say they lose 40 seats in the House. The Republicans lose 40 seats in the House. Who's Trump going to blame that on? It's because they refuse to shore up his elections, he'll say. So you can already see him sort of 4 steps ahead, planning how he's going to navigate the next coming years based on how this plays out in a whole range of directions.
Well, seed planting seems to work very well, unless, of course, there are other issues people have, and the polling does say that. Stand by, everyone, please. Remember, you are all a part of this show.